안녕하세요. 강준호 선생님이라고 합니다. 오늘 IB Lang&Lit이라는 과목의 페이퍼 1에 대해서 강의를 해드릴 건데 다양한 분들이 계실 것 같아요. 페이퍼 1을 여러 번 써봤는데 성적이 안 올라서 어떻게 해야 되나 고민하는 분도 계실 것 같고, 또 Lang&Lit을 아예 들을까 말까 고민하시는 분도 있을 것 같고, 아니면은 Lang&Lit을 들으시면서 또 다양한 고민이 있는 학생들도 있으실 것 같은데, 오늘은 Lang&Lit의 가장 큰 어사이먼트들 중에 하나인 페이퍼 1에 대해서 제가 개요 및 팁들을 드릴 생각이고요. 그리고 마지막에는 예시 텍스트를 가지고 간단히 분석 예시를 드리면서 좀 어떤 요소들을 분석하면 좋을지, 어떤 식으로 메시지를 해석하면 좋을지, 그리고 에세이를 쓸 때 문단들은 어떻게 구조하면 좋을지, 이런 것들에 대해서 간단히 좀 제시를 해드려 보려고 합니다. 그리고 강의는 영어로 진행해 보겠습니다. Okay, so before we start, we want to establish what paper 1 itself is. What exactly is this assignment? Essentially what we're doing is we're performing an analysis of unseen text, right? This is quite intentional because the IB wants to most likely know your real understanding of literary techniques and language use, right? So they're intentionally giving you unseen text so that you're not predicting something, you're not memorizing something, but you're really giving a raw version of what your understanding of language use can be. And as I said, you're trying to show your capacity to understand style, meaning, and effort and effect, which is the most important. So essentially what we're trying to do is trying to decipher what the author is doing to persuade the audience so that they can deliver the message that they intend. So that's why effect is the most important. In any text, advertisement, blog, opinion article, satirical cartoon, letter, whichever the case, the author has an intent. And in order to deliver that intent, the author is trying to manipulate the reader's psychology or affect the readers in a certain way to deliver that message effectively. So we're doing that reverse engineering of discovering what the author is doing to affect the readers a certain way so that they're able to kind of convey a point that they wanted to make. And we also want to make sure that the critical response is structured, right? Structure is one of the biggest criteria in general in any IB writing, but I've mentioned how we're trying to decipher the author's intent, but it's important to know that we're not doing that in a random way. There has to be a structure that we're following, and we'll go over some body paragraph structure and guide for the rest during the rest of this lecture. What you should do first when we see an unseen text, we'll see later an unseen text for you guys, which is, first of all, identify the text type. So, as I said, it can be an advertisement, it can be an opinion article, it can be a poster, infographic, campaign. There's so many types of text that we're studying in language and literature, so that we have a diverse understanding and not too focused on one area kind of understanding in language use and its impact, right? But when we see that in the introduction of the essay, we want to be able to establish that, this text type is this. So that you show and demonstrate an understanding that you understand these text types. And then audience and purpose, right? So each text has a target audience, most likely. It's very, very rare that on an IB exam you see an unseen text. There is a broad text that is targeting everybody. It's either targeting a certain demographic, it could be a set of parents, it could be a certain age group, certain gender, certain nation, certain culture. So many different things. So upon reading it, it's important to understand the target audience. Why? Because as I said, the author is trying to manipulate the audience in a certain way to prove a point, to convey a point. In that sense, if the author doesn't understand the target audience that they're trying to target at, then the effect might not be very effective in the first place, right? So for us, in order to decipher that process, we need to have a solid understanding of the audience ourselves so that we can kind of try to see what the author was thinking in the first place, right? And purpose, obviously, that goes without saying, but it's the author's intent that the text is trying to accomplish. Brainstorm the style and key themes for the given text. I think we kind of established that, what is in the text, how is the text structured, and what is the text discussing as far as topic, as I wrote in the key themes, in order to achieve its purpose. That is something we can consider. Literary devices. So I'm sure if you have taken Lang&Lit or if you have taken 9th grade, 10th grade English, you might have covered literary devices. What are some of the literary devices that we commonly know? There's tone, there's structure, there's symbolism, metaphor, imagery, image themselves, title, font, color, so many different things. Any strategic choice that an author made in the text is a literary device. So upon reading the unseen text for the first place, we might be able to kind of see, okay, what devices did the author use? What kind of weapons did the author use in order for them to kind of dive deep into our minds? That is a good question to ask in the first place when we're writing a paper one. Another thing, what is included in the essay? So I wanted to go over the structure of the essay because as I mentioned, the structure of the essay is really important because it can't be a randomly organized essay for us to get a 7 or 6 or a high grade in the Lang&Lit exam. First will be introduction. So in the introduction, what we're doing is essentially giving the readers, giving the examiner the context of this text. So it's very likely on the text there will be information on the publisher, who the author is, at least briefly, and what the text is, right? So you might want to be able to describe, okay, so this, let's say, is an opinion article published by the New York Times, and in regards to this topic, author is this kind of person, and the text is discussing certain things, right? So you're kind of proving to the examiner that you have a comprehension level understanding of the text. So you're kind of giving that context, and then you end with the thesis, which would be kind of the purpose here that I mentioned. What is a thesis? Thesis is the answer to the question. Okay, so when I say that, what is the question? In paper one, there's usually a guiding question on the unseen text. It's usually on the sort of, what kind of devices are making a certain impact, or what is the role of a certain device. But you're not directly supposed to answer that question. It's meant to be a guiding question where it's supposed to be something you refer to as you're writing a response. So what is it you're actually answering in paper one? In any paper one, the question you're answering is, how does the author use certain literary devices to create a certain impact or convey a certain message? You're answering that question. So in that sense, what should the thesis be? And what should the end of the introduction, which is a thesis, be? This thesis should very likely be, again, some teachers don't prefer this style, so we might manipulate here and there, but at its core, the central idea is that the author is using device A, B, and C to convey message X, right? Something, with that structure, of course the phrasing can be different. Sometimes you put the devices in later body paragraphs instead of in the thesis, but that is the most basic form of thesis, the answer to the question. How does the author use devices to create an impact? The author uses this, this, and this to convey something, right? That is the thesis, and you'll wrap up the introduction there, and the thesis is the core of the essay. In every body paragraph, you're referring back to the thesis so that the message, one message is clear. And then there comes body paragraphs. We'll cover the body paragraphs in the later slides. I'll go dive into the structure of the body paragraph, how to structure it. And then there is the conclusion. Conclusion is not that complex. Usually, conclusion is a restate of the thesis. And also, what I generally recommend to students who are aiming for 7 is, give an extension of what can the reader kind of take away from this text? What can the reader further examine in regards to the topic that the author of the unseen text was examining? All those things can be mentioned, but they're not a requirement. This is an introductory class, so I will not mention the extension stuff yet, but please note that those are kind of options we can take in future steps. Right, and then as I mentioned, we want to go through the body paragraph. So what is a body paragraph? Body paragraph is where you're making central points. You're proving the thesis yourself in a paragraph form, right? And usually what I recommend, the structure that I recommend is called PEEL, P-E-E-L. I think some schools name it as petal structure. There are a lot of names that refer to it, but essentially promise me all those different names, all those different structures are trying to accomplish the same thing. You're trying to make a point first. What is a point? As I said, this is a branch of your thesis. What do I mean by that? Again, I'm talking about the most basic form of paper one. In a topic sentence, what you would do is, because in the thesis we mentioned 3 different devices that all combine to convey a meaning. In one of the body paragraphs, what you'll do is usually just choose one device to examine. So the author, let's say, uses tone to convey that blah, 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 right? So that would be your point you're trying to make. And in the later sections, what you're doing is you're trying to prove that point. You're trying to persuade the audience that your point was accurate, right? And you would like to, in order to prove a point, and again, you're using the text that the author is doing something in that text, it might be obviously stronger. Your argument will become inevitably stronger if you quote and actually mention a specific part of the text, right? So evidence would be a quote or a reference reference or a specific detail, right? Where there might be an example of a literary device that was used in the text, or there was something that made an imprint in your mind that you wanted to bring into your body paragraph to kind of make your point. And here comes the hard part: explanation. So again, we already proved the point, and we were trying to prove a point that there has been a device that is used to create a certain impact, right? So explaining why that literary device, why that technique creates effect to the readers. As I said, the author is trying to manipulate the psychology of the readers usually to convey a point. So here you're trying to explain, okay, why does that device impact the reader a certain way? Why does that device make us think about something? Why does that device make us want to do something? Why does that device create an emotional response from us? All those things can be options of an impact that the author can make. And then what you do in link is connecting back to the thesis to a wider message. So essentially, you are making a connection back to your original point of, okay, because the author was able to make certain kind of impact, with that impact, the author is trying to convey a message effectively. You're trying to comment on that in the final section of the body paragraph. Does that make sense? So essentially, as I mentioned, as I repeat, this is a reverse psychology of the author, where the author's intended various impacts and was able to put certain elements to impact the readers a certain way. What we're doing is we're reversing that and trying to prove a point that the author was intending these things and how they were able to effectively achieve their purposes with devices. That is what paper 1 is. That is the core essence of paper 1. Does that make sense? A couple tips, and we'll move on to the sample text. So first of all, build everything around a clear thesis. As I said, thesis is what the answer to the question. The answer to the question means a sentence form of the entirety of the essay that you're trying to write, right? So that means everything, every body paragraph, every point has to be related, and not only related, connected to the thesis. Again, in this essay, you're trying to prove only one point, that the author is using certain devices to create an impact and convey a message, right? So please make sure don't deviate from the thesis is what I'm saying. That's why I usually recommend when we're actually writing paper 1, outlining first, because if we start improvising as we're writing, the structure becomes kind of difficult. As I mentioned in the last section of the body paragraph, you're supposed to connect back to the thesis, but sometimes you'll end up landing at a point where the message isn't really aligned with the thesis, right? Avoid summary. This is really important. Yes, you're trying to prove that and show that you are able to comprehend this text. At the same time, you have to do more than that. In the body paragraph, notice how I mentioned how after the example, you're trying to examine into, what the author was intending, how the author is trying to affect us and impact us mentally, and then trying to convey that message. That is analysis. But oftentimes what students do is they're trying to prove a point that they understood the text, and they start explaining to the examiner, what this text is about. While that's okay, right? That's not wrong. That's not necessarily fitting to the purpose of paper 1 is the tip I want to say. Right? So never trying to show that you're understanding this. Your understanding is given, but you're giving a unique perspective of your point from your perspective to the examiner. That's your job. Connect devices directly to the message. Yeah, don't just list. Don't just make a list of device. Always make sure how the device is. Make sure to explain how the devices is used to convey the message. Try to use precise analytical terms. Yeah, so contrast, tone, imagery. I mentioned a lot of literary devices. You know, it could be, as I said, images themselves, colors, font, structure, anything, right? Anything can be a device, but make sure to use specific terms that refer to those devices rather than making a vague description for yourself, right? And conclude by showing how these techniques unify the text purpose. What I mean by that is, again, as I said, you're trying to prove one point in this essay. One point, right? So make sure when you read this essay as practice, the drafts you write, there is a coherence that, oh, okay, so all these things combine to prove one point that I'm trying to make about the author's choices. While it's valuable to think about diverse perspectives, and obviously in our outline, in our investigation of the text, we should consider diverse perspectives, but please make sure to know that in paper one, you're conveying only one perspective and one perspective only. You don't get that much time to explore anyways. Okay, so do you guys see this text? Let me back off a little bit so that you guys can read this cartoon a little bit. And you guys feel free to pause and look through this cartoon, okay? Okay, so this is a sample paper one text, and what I want to do is perform somewhat of a sample analysis, more so of analyzing each of the elements and see each of the relevant elements and see how we can utilize them into paper one, so that upon seeing this text for the first time, it might be hard to understand. Again, it's a cartoon, it tends to be quite casual, right? But we're trying to perform a formal analysis of it. So I wanted to pinpoint into what we can analyze together. So in the introduction that I said, we have to write somewhat of an overview or context of the cartoon. So let's say this is a cartoon. This is a, let's say, Lunar Baboon webcomic, right, it seems. And it seems like from the first glance, the narrative is that it's kind of showing a short, reflective, family-centered humor, I guess, right? And then it's using very simple visuals and dialogue between father and child. And the topic itself is kind of discussing the idea of permanence, the idea of change, right? And I guess the purpose there's no right answer. I always tell students how when you're interpreting the message of the audience, there's no right answer, but there's a spectrum of right answer. We can't overanalyze something to the point where we're ending up with an interpretation that that it's not in the realm of author's intention, right? So I think what it's discussing upon first glance is it's trying to comfort readers, it's trying to provoke reflection, and also remind us that, you know, everything shifts with time, but there are certain things that stays the same, right? I think that's one of the biggest takeaways from this cartoon. And upon looking at that, I think having that philosophy, having that perspective in mind in the cartoon will be really helpful. Well, so, and then let's look at structure. We can maybe perhaps, okay, in your outline of paper one, perhaps what you can look at, and the one option of looking at in terms of literary device is structure, right? What do you notice from the structure? Well, so, I mean, there's a panel structure that kind of mirrors the rhythm of the daily life, right? Like there's, it's quite minimalistic, so there's pause and question, reassurance, and it does make the theme of change almost conversational and normal instead of something abstract, right? It grounds the topic of change as less something abstract, but something a part of our lives rather, right? And there's also the minimalist visuals that are doing the work, right? Why would this be, you know, if this cartoon had 1,000 colors and a much more graphic descriptions of human faces, how much change would there be, right? These minimalist visuals they're keeping our attention on father and child themselves, so that I guess relationships are what remain constant in the changing world, right? The visuals are not flashy intentionally to shift the reader's attention to the core of the meaning of the relationship between these people. If they were flashy, it may seem like another thing that fades away, right? But the core theme, it seems, is that even though time flies and time changes things, there are certain things that remain permanent. So those are kind of the visual and structure that we may want to investigate in paper 1. Another thing would be dialogue, right? Notice how fonts are almost like handwritings, right? And there are rounded speech bubbles here and there. By rounded, I mean like almost non-visible / like we just kind of get a hint of a speech bubble existing, right? Why is that? I think handwritten style and the rounded speech bubbles here convey imperfection, right? Because a perfect cartoon would have a really round speech bubble here, but they don't have that intentionally. It looks really roughly sketched. And I think it does convey warmth and imperfection and accessibility, right? And I guess that really aligns with the idea that there are certain things that stays, right? Life is not rigid, right? And relationships are not rigid. And with that tone, we're able to kind of convey, we're able to kind of sense the warmth that the author is trying to convey in the meaning of the relationships, right? Another thing, father's words, he says, everything changes. Well, almost everything here. What do you think, what kind of emotions do you feel here? I would say there's something like it balances the sad inevitability with comfort. So it offers a stable anchor amidst uncertainty of changing world. So those kind of dialogue can be analyzed as well. I'll say the calm, affectionate tone of the dialogue here kind of, I guess, eases both the child's worry about the changing world, but also the reader's it allows and invites reader's reflecting on kind of the existential themes more approachable, you know? It's almost inviting the readers as if the readers are the children and as if the father is the author's mind trying to speak to the readers that certain things don't change. Certain things change, but it's okay, right? Why do you think the simplicity of this cartoon works? Well, I think there are multiple things that the author's doing that is doing really well, that they're doing really well. There's the visual and verbal minimalism, I guess mirrors the message that, you know, sometimes it's okay to strip away the external elements to concentrate on the essentials, right? Because there are certain things that remain important to us no matter what happens in our society, in our changing world, in our turbulent world, right? And also, childlike exchange almost makes the profound truths more clear, right? If it was an adult, they would be guarded, they would not speak so candidly, but children are transparent, right? And there's a reason why almost they're placing the questioner as a child, because it allows such an honest, unfiltered reflection, right? And because the truths are presented so clearly, it reminds the readers that even things like mortality and time passing and grief from that can be treated gently, because in the end, those things are not controllable. Those things are not in our realm of manipulation, but they still can be approached gently because there are other important things that we need to care deeply and more actively, right? And in closing insight, each formal choice here, the rhythm of the panel, dialogue, minimalism, I think they're all effectively contributing to the message of the cartoon, and that is what's important. As I said in the conclusion, and as a whole, as an essay, coherence is super important. We need to be able to prove, or I guess show the examiner, why these structures, why the face of the children, and the minimalist face of the children rather, and the father, and the font, and the lack of speech bubble, and the minimalist structure, and the gray and white tone, all of these combine to convey one message. So that is something we need to think about when we're approaching these texts. How are these devices all designed to convey one point that the author is trying to make? Okay? So let me close a little bit by kind of offering you a reminder of body paragraph structure, because in closing, like, remembering that all the elements we discussed, so devices, introduction, analysis, and conclusion, they're all coming together in one Peel paragraph, right? So think of Peel as the backbone of your essay. That's just a reminder. I know we covered this, but your point should clearly state how a particular device or feature is contributing to the meaning, the author's intent here. And evidence should be grounding your claim in the text, right? So that you show that your argument is anchored in this text, right? And it could be a quotation, it could be a phrase, or it could be a structural detail that you're mentioning. Especially in the cartoon, there are a lot of visual elements, so you don't always need to analyze the language itself, although you do need to mention a few times in the other parts of your essay, right? An explanation is where you dig deeper. You know, how does diction means word choice, shape the tone? And, you know, how does imagery influence the reader's emotions and thoughts, right? And this is the heart of analysis, where you're trying to explain how the author is trying to impact us. What is the author trying to get us to think about? What is the author trying to get us to feel? What is the author getting to try us to do? You know, do we feel motivated to do something? Do we become reflective? All these things are psychological impact that the author is making through this cartoon, right? So in other texts that we see for the first time, that is the question we should be grounding our analysis on. And finally, link is tying your paragraph back to your thesis and kind of showing the examiner how you're not just noticing techniques, but you're kind of integrating them into a coherent argument. Does that make sense? So it's almost like each body paragraph is becoming a focused mini argument that is building towards your thesis. And if you stay consistent with this structure, what I'm trying to get you to remind yourselves that if you stay consistent with your structure, your paper one will not only summarizing the text, but will be able to demonstrate your personal insight and your interpretive perspective in the text. And that is where the points come, in my opinion. As a student who's trying to demonstrate an understanding of an advanced level of language use, not only do you need to not summarize, I think it's important to put your interpretation into it. I believe that the author is trying to accomplish this. It seems that the author is trying to prove a point where blah, 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 right? So make sure, following this Peel structure, your argument that you're making in paper one is not simply a restate of the text or an explanation of the text, but rather what the author has intended in the first place, in the beginning of the text, and how the author is trying to generate impact upon intentionally designed and placed devices in these texts, whether it's a cartoon, blog post, opinion article, anything like that, okay? So make sure to kind of, when you're if it's your first time analyzing, please try to follow that structure so that guided thought process is there rather than you're going south to summarize. Or if you're struggling with your grade in paper one, try to follow that structure and try to, you know, ask yourself the many questions that I asked you guys throughout this lecture, right? And paper one's meant to be kind of difficult, and it's hard to study for it because obviously it ends up being an assignment where you're studying an unseen text anyways. However, if we practice being able to think critically with these structures, with many different genres of unseen text, and we're able to kind of study the structure and the core of the body paragraph, what the body paragraph is trying to accomplish, I think anyone can do a good job in English Lang&Lit Paper 1. All right, thank you so much for listening. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.